this time, I'd like to ask Stefano Zanera, our International Conference Chair, to the podium.
Thank you very much. Hello. Thanks, Andrea, for standing up to the podium even with our current conditions. I'm sure we really appreciate you talking to all of our members and trying your best yesterday evening. At this time, I'm really delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for today. This year, we have been really fortunate to have two of the luminaries of the profession talk to us. Today, we are going to listen to Dan Geer. Dan is a security researcher, describes himself as a security researcher with a quantitative bent. As a security researcher myself, I can certainly appreciate all of his writing, and he's one of the few people that I really tend to listen to very carefully whenever he chooses to speak or write. From MIT in the 1980s, where his group produced something like Kerberos that I think everybody knows, through a number of startups, and today he is the CISO of In-Q-Tel, which is the strategic investment arm of the US intelligence community. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dan Geer.
Good morning. Thank you for that. And it's a pleasure to be here. I hope you take that as a genuine statement and not a cliche. I'm not going to do this with slides. I'm going to do it with prepared remarks. And they will be available in text form to you through the office immediately after. And sort of like that old Jay Leno commercial, eat all you like, we'll make more. In this case, do as you will with it. As far as I'm concerned, anytime you speak in public, you've, in so many words, given up the right to copyright or anything else. This is entirely for you. And I won't take questions from up here, but I will hang around for as long as people want to talk afterwards. Those of you who at the end of the talk wish to escape are welcome to do so. Been in that seat out there, so I know how that goes. All right, so my topic for today is intelligence. And it's a daunting topic, that of intelligence. Its history is long, but its greatest successes are not necessarily chronicled in objective ways, and ditto its failures. Its scope ranges from nation states down to the personal, though the character of what constitutes intelligence dramatically changes with scale, of course. The word intelligence, as we will use it here today, is that of an activity, not a description of a human being. However, note that the word intelligence derives from the Latin verb intelligere, to comprehend or to perceive. And so one might say that intelligence as a term in psychology is not all that different than intelligence as a term in national affairs. I would therefore suggest that intelligence is that which enables decision-making, and in turn, which improves outcomes. That's still passing vague, but intelligence as a contributor to decision-making is the idea that I will hold throughout this talk. There are other aspects of decision-making, principal among them timeliness, and we'll come to that in due course. As some of you know, with two others, we started a mailing list and a workshop series on security metrics. That was unbelievably 10 years ago. And for me, at least, the entire point of security metrics, both then and now, is that of decision support. I respect science and those who chronicle the natural world, but chasing down numbers that let me make better decisions is what security metrics and, in the greater context, intelligence is all about. Here I might quote Edward Tufte, the well-known statistical graphics guru, that, quote, if your numbers are boring, you've got the wrong numbers. That allows me to state his comment in the contrapositive, namely that if you have the right numbers, you're not going to be bored. There's a question here of sorts, and namely whether we have decisions to support for which intelligence can usefully play a role? The straightforward answer is, of course it can. In fact, intelligence is essential. The somewhat less straightforward answer is it depends on the intelligence. To the extent that one can assess one's own biases, mine are that while numbers are endlessly fascinating, they are not to be sought for their own sake, but rather for that purpose or decision support. Medicine, where I worked for 15 years, has a term of art that encapsulates the idea. The term is no therapeutic difference, meaning that if a blood test or a scan or some other imaging of what you have might improve the subtle precision of a subtle diagnosis, if the therapy would nevertheless remain the same, then the pursuit of further diagnostic precision is not medicine but something else. In other words, and as we say on the security metrics mailing list, I'm a measurer, not a modeler. But let me be clear about one thing that may make cybersecurity different than everything else, and that is that we have sentient opponents. The physicist does not. The chemist does not. Not even the economist has sentient opponents. We do. What puzzles we have to solve are not drawn from some generally diminishing store of unsolved puzzles. Nor could our theories completely explain all observable fact, thus reducing our worries and our work to engineering alone. There is something different about a search for truth when there isn't any, or at least there isn't any that lasts long enough to exhaustively explore. There's something different when what we can detect and from which we can then infer is even partly under the control of people who have cross purposes to ours. The word intelligence, as we're using it here, certainly has a military ring to it. As I've said before, in the 1990s, the commercial sector caught up with the mill sector in the application of cryptography, not its design, but its application. We're now passing the knee of the curve for the commercial sector to catch up to the mill sector in traffic analysis. On the commercial side, we may be also catching up in the use of disinformation, though that is inherently harder to ascertain. Harder still is ascertaining if the commercial sector is engaged in covert action. But there is little doubt that the commercial sector has now deployed more listening points than has the mill sector. What the commercial sector is, however, rediscovering is that it is easier to drown in information than it is to profit from it. It's one of those lessons that can only be learned the hard way. There are, in other words, parallels between cybersecurity and the classic military intelligence functions insofar as predicting the future has a strong role to play in preparing your defenses for probable attacks. As Dave Eitel has repeatedly pointed out, the hardest part of crafting good attack tools is testing them before deployment. Knowing what your tool will find and how to cope with that is surely harder than finding an exploitable flaw in the first place. This too may grow in importance if the rigor of testing causes attackers to use some portion of the internet at large as their test platform, rather than whatever rig they can afford to set up in their own laboratories. If that is the case, then full-scale traffic logs become an indispensable intelligence tool insofar as when an attack happens, and it appears to be de novo, those with full-scale traffic logs may be in a position to answer the question, how long has this been going on? The company NetWitness, which is now part of EMC, is one player that comes to mind in this regard, and there are, of course, others. This idea of looking backwards for evidence that you didn't previously know enough to look for does certainly have intelligence value both for the nation state and for the enterprise. The idea of looking forward with what people are willing to reveal in open source has even more value, as the company Recorded Future has demonstrated to my satisfaction. When one is doing science, one collects data and tells everyone how that collection was done, so that, where necessary, your findings can be refuted by others. As you may have read, science is in a crisis of sorts in this very regard. Some notable fraction of all scientific papers cannot be reproduced. As one analysis of this building crisis said, and I quote, "Reproducibility is a defining feature of science, but the extent to which it characterizes current research is unknown. Replication success is better predicted by the strength of original evidence than by characteristics of the original or the replication teams. That's an important observation. The trustworthiness of an inference is proportional to its reproducibility, and its reproducibility is proportional to the strength of the evidence collected. But is that true only for science? One might go so far as to say that the importance of the decisions to be made must be reflected in the quality of the information that is collected. Or maybe not. There's certainly a lot of hard decisions to make now, for which good data is not readily available in any sense. You surely know some of this, but speaking from a statistician's point of view, which incidentally is what I was originally trained as, you would prefer that your measurements, whatever they are, be both accurate and precise. When that is not possible, there are trade-offs to be made. If your measurement instrument misses a lot, then it may be that you cannot believe the numbers it produces, at least per se, but even a poor quality measurement will yield trend lines. Even if the actual values given are erroneous, so long as those errors are not closely correlated with the values being measured, then the shape of the trend line will be correct. Spoken of differently, a situation where you have sampling but have no way to tell what your sampling fraction is will still yield trend line data so long as your sampling fraction is stable. In any case, I would argue that absolute measures are not the goal in cybersecurity, that relative measures are sufficient for the simple fact that relative measures, like such and such a risk is getting worse, are sufficient for decision support. This has parallels in the physical world. No police department will ever know how much heroin is for sale, but they can tell the price. And a rising or falling price is sufficient for decision making about what to do and whether what was done has had a positive effect. Over a small number of years, the term data science has become commonplace. It seems first to have been used over 50 years ago, but the current usage stems most directly from a 1997 lecture by Jeffrey Wu with the title, "Does Statistics Equal Data Science?" Wu characterized statistical work as a trilogy of data collection, data modeling, and decision-making. In his lecture's conclusion, he initiated the modern use of the term data science, and he advocated that statistics be renamed data science and statisticians be renamed data scientists. Those semantics seem to add little clarity to what the collection, modeling, and use of data provide, but argument over terminology is a hallmark of how a science proceeds. Which brings us to ask whether cybersecurity is or could become a science. A few months ago, I tried to round up some ideas on that very question, taking as my guide T.S. Kuhn's seminal work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The question of whether cybersecurity is yet a science is a hard one. I'm sorely tempted to answer the question, is cybersecurity a science, with getting closer, but not yet. To say, in other words, that we are in a pre-science stage. With several others, I'm one of the expert reviewers for the National Security Agency's annual Science of Security Competition and Award. Quoting its rationale, the competition was established to recognize the current security paper that best reflects the conduct of good science in the work described. Science of security is a broad enterprise involving both theoretical and empirical work. While there can be only one best paper, any one paper cannot span that full breadth. Nonetheless, the field is broad and all facets are encouraged and needed. The common denominator across the variety of approaches is solid methodology and effective communication, so those aspects of the papers are strong factors in our decision making. So that would be something that you might want to look at, is the Science of Security Award every year. The next one will be announced in November. And of course, if you're particularly fond of a given paper, nominating that for next year would be helpful. In fact, papers are nominated for consideration, and I encourage you to do exactly that. But I'm also here to report that amongst the members of the reviewing committee, our views of what constitutes a, quote, science of security, unquote, vary rather a lot. Some of us would prioritize purpose. are agreeing with Charles Darwin that all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any use. Some of us view aspects of methodology as paramount, especially, as hinted above, reproducibility and the clarity of communication on which it depends. Some of us are ever on the lookout for what a physicist would call a unifying field theory. Some of us insist on the classic process of hypothesis generation followed by designed experiments. We vary, and I take that to be a vote of sorts on whether cybersecurity is yet a science. But Darwin's remark that all observation must be for or against some purpose is not quite right, at least not quite right for us here. It is not so simple as Wu's data collection, data modeling, and decision making. When you collect data and with it build a model, your goal matters. If your purpose in building a model is to come to a definitive conclusion about causality, about how nature works, then you're saying that the inputs to your model and the coefficients that calibrate their influence within your model are what matters. Parsimony, in the sense of Occam's razor, is your judge, or as Saint-Exupéry described, you know that you have achieved perfection in design, not when you have nothing more to add, but when you have nothing more to take away. By contrast, when your purpose in building a model is to enable control of some purpose or other, then you will not mind if your input variables are correlated or redundant. Their correlation and their redundancy are not an issue if your goal is to direct action rather than to explain causality. In some circumstances, you can do both. That is, you can both explain causality and enable control. In those situations, it is your model's ability to do prediction that both satisfies the reader that you have captured the causal relationship and that the model's predictions can be operationalized irrespective of underlying truth. A goal of understanding causality in its full elegance leads to F equals ma, or E equals mc squared, or the like. A goal of control leads to econometric models with thousands of input variables, each of whose individual contribution is neither clear nor relevant. That may all seem harsh, but it is not meant that way at all. Consider anomaly detection and its role in current cybersecurity products. Anomaly detection presumes something about distributions of detectable events, namely that within a selected interval, anything outside some bounding box is worth investigation. It is not concerned with causality. It is concerned with control, irrespective of causality. That is a coherent strategy, to be sure, and has some side effects. Or consider big data and deep learning. Even if Moore's law remains forever valid, there will never be enough computing. Hence, data-driven algorithms must favor efficiency above all else. Yet the more efficient the algorithm, the less interrogatable it is, a term of art from Michael Osborne, a professor at Oxford. That is to say, the more optimized the algorithm is, the harder it is to know what the algorithm is really doing. That was the exact theme of a workshop held by Morgan Stanley and the Santa Fe Institute last fall, titled, Are Optimality and Efficiency the Enemies of Robustness and Resilience? All the speakers answered yes in one form or another. And there's a feedback loop here. The more desirable some particular automation is, the more data it is given. The more data it is given, the more its data utilization efficiency matters. The more its data utilization efficiency matters, the more its algorithms will evolve to opaque operation. Above some threshold of dependence on such an algorithm in practice, there can be no going back. As such, preserving algorithm interrogatability, despite efficiency-seeking, self-driven automation, is the research-grade problem that is now on the table. If science does not pick this up, then Larry Lessig's characterization of code as law is fulfilled. A couple of law professors, in fact, have seized on that very idea and suggested that price-fixing collusion amongst robot traders will be harder to detect than collusion amongst people. I am involved in a few of the many information sharing initiatives that seem to be everywhere at once. In one, and speaking in the context of control, this comment was made. Some of your data suppliers may not want to send you data if you display it as soon as you get it. as that may be used by bad people to notice that they have been detected or to game the detection systems. Sure, you can obfuscate the data, but that's a lot of work to gain a few minutes or hours of statistics. Now, that writer was emphasizing that we are operationally likely to choose control over basic research and that we have real opponents. But the point is this: if we choose control as the purpose of our efforts, then we will have to let causality become harder to see because our models will submerge any causal relationships in a thicket of confounding. If instead we focus on causality, the very things that we need to measure become harder to get. If for no other reason, our sentient opponents will make that so. As I said earlier, I'm for measurement as decision support. I am in the control camp, not the causality camp. At the same time, I do want to be able to ask some algorithm, why did you do that? And get a meaningful answer. Overall, having both control and interrogatability is a difficult problem, to say the least. What I want is to predict the future. I want it for reasons that are no doubt emotionally clear, but I also want it because of my own definition of security, which is this: a state of security is the absence of unmitigatable surprise. As always in cybersecurity, we are now talking trade-offs. One of those is in deciding how many failures is the right number of failures. It can't be unbounded upward, that's obvious. It can't be zero either, as zero quite likely means that you're overspending, and in any case, learning from failure is especially crisp. As Francis Bacon said, truth emerges more readily from error than from confusion. Defining a state of security as the absence of unmitigatable surprise mirrors what I know to call the availability calculus, namely that we can get 100% availability by driving the time between failures to infinity or by driving the time to repair to zero. I am searching for prediction because I want to drive to infinity the time between failures for which I have no mitigations, and to drive to zero the time to repair failures for which I do. That is where the focus on control leads you, or at least I so think at this time. But one might ask, why prediction? Why speculate? The late Michael Crichton gave a magnificent essay with that exact title in April 2002. Boiled down, Crichton simply said that no one knows the future, and those who pretend to do so are self-serving, delusional, or something equivalently uncomplimentary. So are the people who believe what the predictors say. He notes how big the prediction industry has become. Mind you, this is 2002, singling out media especially, and he reminds us that the track record for sweeping predictions is pretty poor. He coins a clinical term, and I might as well quote his text where he does so. I'm now reading Crichton. Media carries with it a credibility that is totally undeserved. You have all experienced this in what I call the Murray-Gell-Mann amnesia effect. I refer to it by this name because I once managed to discuss it with Murray Gell-Mann, and by dropping a famous name, I imply greater importance to myself and to the effect than it otherwise would have. Briefly stated, the Gell-Mann amnesia effect is as follows. You open the newspaper to an article on some subject you know well. In Murray's case, physics. In mine, show business. You read the article and see the journalist has absolutely no understanding of either the facts or the issues. Often the article is so wrong it actually presents the story backward, reversing cause and effect. I call these wet streets cause rain stories. Paper's full of them. In any case, you read with exasperation or amusement the multiple errors in a story, and then you turn the page to national or international affairs and read it as if the rest of the newspaper was somehow more accurate about Palestine than the baloney you just read. You turn the page and you forget what you know. That is the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. I'd point out that it does not operate in other arenas of life. In ordinary life, if someone consistently exaggerates or lies to you, you soon discount everything they have to say. In court, there's a legal doctrine of falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus, which means untruthful in one part, untruthful in all. But when it comes to media, we believe against evidence that it is probably worth our time to read other parts of the paper, when in fact it almost certainly is not. The only possible explanation for this is amnesia. That's the end of Crichton's remarks. Everyone here, though, knows exactly what Crichton was talking about, or was 13 years ago. What is written about cybersecurity for the general audience is, sadly, often counterfactual or counterlogical. Unfortunately, what is written for specific audiences, including legislatures and regulatory agencies, can also be counterfactual or counterlogical. And all of this finds an audience because of an actual need that I argue is acutely important for cybersecurity. We need to predict if the future, if our tools are to intersect our problems on target and in time. There's a theme here. The fast-moving nature and, yes, the unpredictability of the cybersecurity regime are such that were it occasionally possible to make useful predictions, we would be much better off, much better able to accomplish our security plans while those plans were still meaningful. At the same time, and especially in cybersecurity, no one can predict the future. We desperately need prediction. We know it. It is near impossible to do, and increasingly so. At the same time, I am myself entirely guilty of trying to do prediction in cybersecurity. I give speeches on this precisely. I'm working on a personal project right now whose only point is prediction. With a quant colleague, I've long run another. I work on the periphery of the intelligence community, and the intelligence community is entirely about prediction, constantly speculating on what is our actual position and what is our actual velocity. If your very job is security in any sense, then you want all the prediction you can get. Yet at the same time, surprises happen. If he were still with us, Crichton would remind us that the problem with speculation is that it piggybacks on the Gell-Mann effect of unwarranted credibility, making the speculation look more useful than it is. One can argue that compliance is a predictive exercise based on the idea that if you do this thing, then you can approach the future with less to fear. I buy that train of thought and do so wholeheartedly. But what if the rules to be complied with cannot keep up with the rate of change? If they cannot, then whatever the prediction of outcome that compliance promises is prediction made relative to conditions that no longer hold. That can't be good. That can't be useful. Unpredictability is so true in cybersecurity that we have a special name for when prediction fails: zero day. We accept that a genuine zero day is an attack that no one could have seen coming. We so very often imply that failing to handle that zero day is blameless since, after all, it was not predicted. Yet every time a particularly lurid zero day shows up, I find myself asking, could I have predicted that? How? Bruce Schneier asked a question that is simple to state, a question we have yet to answer, a question where getting the answer right will change things. Are vulnerabilities sparse or dense? If and only if vulnerabilities are sparse, does it actually make sense to allocate the effort to find them or reward those who do, or to set up apparati for sharing information about those vulnerabilities? If vulnerabilities are dense, then treasure should not go to finding them, but to making systems resilient to them. This speaks directly to security as the absence of unmitigatable surprise, does it not? I re-ask Schneier's question in various settings, and I get strong, and I mean strong, opinions over the full range of dense to sparse. Smart, knowledgeable people say, too dense to measure, while smart, knowledgeable people say, too sparse to measure. That's not a trick question. It's a steering question like no other. In a similar vein, it seems to me that the broad and general we are near a fork in the road, a fork where one road is that of generating provably defect-free code, followed by long-term, brutally rigorous change control, while the other road is that of moving target defense, rapid release, DevOps, etc. These alternatives seem both antithetical yet promising, and both are fed by real scientists making real progress. But after having chosen one road, switching to the other at some later time would seem to be infeasible. This speaks again to the availability calculus. Do we maximize the mean time between failures, or do we minimize the mean time to repair? We cannot do both, nor therefore should we try. I will predict that as automation and artificial intelligence proceeds, we will find that vulnerabilities are in fact dense. There's a recent paper that is very much worth your time to read. Global Cyberspace is Safer Than You Think, Real Trends in Cybercrime, written by Eric Jardine and released by the Chatham House this past July. Its message is exactly that given by its title, that cyberspace is getting better, not getting worse, that cyberspace is getting more safe, not getting more dangerous. The argument for that message is that to think cyberspace is ever worse, ever more dangerous, comes from failing to properly normalize whatever measures of safety you've heretofore been paying attention to. It is only fair to quote the front matter of his paper directly. Information technology security firms such as Norton Symantec and Kaspersky Labs publish yearly reports that generally show the security of cyberspace to be poor and often getting worse. This paper argues that the level of security in cyberspace is actually far better than the picture described by media accounts and IT security reports. Currently, numbers on the occurrence of cybercrime are almost always depicted in either absolute, 1,000 attacks a year, or as year-over-year percentage change, 50% more attacks in 2014 than 2013. To get an accurate picture of the security of cyberspace, cybercrime statistics need to be expressed as a proportion of the growing size of the internet, similar to the routine practice of expressing crime as a proportion of population, such as 15 murders per 1,000 per year. In particular, the absolute numbers tend to lead to one of three misrepresentations. First, the absolute numbers say things are getting worse, while the normalized numbers show the situation is improving. Second, both numbers show that things are improving, but the normalized numbers show that things are getting better at a faster rate. And third, both numbers show that things are getting worse, but the normalized numbers indicate that the situation is deteriorating much more slowly than the absolute numbers. Overall, global cyberspace is actually far safer than commonly thought. That was the front matter of his paper, and he goes on from there. In short, Jardine is saying that the denominator matters, that reporting counts of anything is poorer decision support and reporting rates and proportions, that counts of events per unit time will and must mislead. It is incorrect to talk about how much mayhem there is without talking about how much opportunity for mayhem there is. Jardine's line of critique is entirely straightforward, and cyberspace is not the only place where such arguments about the validity of inference are taking place. As a prominent example, consider Steven Pinker's 2012 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. In a synopsis in the Wall Street Journal, he wrote, "We tend to estimate the probability of an event from the ease with which we can recall examples, and scenes of carnage are more likely to be beamed into our homes and burned into our memories than footage of people dying in their beds of old age. There will always be enough violent deaths to fill the evening news, so people's impressions of violence will be disconnected from their actual likelihood." This is again an argument for looking at rates and proportions rather than counts. But in a direct cross, Nassim Nicholas Taleb responded with a paper on the superadditivity and estimation biases of quantile contributions, in which his argument is that when a distribution is fat-tailed, estimations of parameters based on historical experience will inevitably mislead. I'll quote from Taleb now. "When I finished writing The Black Swan in 2006, I was confronted with ideas of, quote, great moderation, unquote, by people who did not realize that the process was getting fatter and fatter tails from operational and financial leverage, complexity, interdependence, and things like that, meaning fewer but deeper departures from the mean. The fact that nuclear bombs explode less often than regular shells does not make them safer. Needless to say that with the arrival of the events of 2008, I did not have to explain myself too much. Nevertheless, people in economics are still using the methods that led to the great moderation narrative, and Bernanke, the protagonist of the theory, has had his mandate renewed. And to highlight his central point, We are undergoing a switch between continuous low-grade volatility to the process moving by jumps, with less and less variation outside of those jumps. Now, having read it, you may find Taleb's paper difficult, but he is speaking to our interest in cybersecurity. Are we getting worse or are we getting better? Is there anything we are currently measuring that is leading us to conclude that we are doing the right things as inferred from measurements of what we believe to be the outcomes? Are our inferences confounded with little understood assumptions about thin tails and Gaussian distributions when we're actually in a fat-tailed power law situation? Are we moving into a world where, as Taleb suggests, we are switching from continuous low-grade volatility to less frequent but much larger jump change in the state of our world? So is the cybersecurity space getting better or getting worse? Jardine asks us to normalize how many events did occur to the size of how many events could have occurred, not how many did occur in an interval of unit time. He is correct that the possible event space is expanding dramatically, accelerating in its expansion by all accounts. Part of that is network extent, which I've estimated as having a 35% compound annual growth rate. Part of that is the question of attack surface, per se. In any case, Jardine is right that when we count events, we are misleading ourselves as to whether we are getting better or getting worse. But does changing the divisor alone really make the correction that we need? There is a power law here, to be sure. Wikipedia's concise reminder is that, quote, power laws have a well-defined mean only if the exponent exceeds 2 and have finite variance only when the exponent exceeds 3. Most identified power laws in nature have exponents such that the mean is well-defined but the variance is not, implying that they are capable of black swan behavior, end of quote. That, my friends, is our situation. Cyberspace does not have a well-defined variance for what can go wrong, and hence cyberspace is unarguably capable of black swan behavior. The late Elroy Dimpson, as quoted by Peter Bernstein, famously suggested that the definition of risk is that more things can happen than will, and our rate of growth and interdependence is absolutely making the number of things that can happen much larger. Unfortunately, complexity prevents us from counting the number of things that can happen. Hence, Jardine's argument that we divide the number of things that did happen by the number of things that could have happened is correct in spirit, but would be irrelevant if our estimate of the number of things that could have happened were to be wrong. However, if the denominator is the number of things that could have happened, and we severely underestimate that denominator, doesn't that make the news even better? Taleb says no, and emphatically. The fat tails of power law distributions enlarge the variance of our estimates, leading to less frequent but more severe failures. The best one could say is that most days will be better and better, but some will be worse than ever. Everything with a power law underneath has that property. Think earthquakes and whether one is overdue in California. And cyberspace's interconnectivity and interdependence are inherently power law phenomena. In an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, Thomas Lee recounted how, quote, I found myself at a dinner in a fancy Menlo Park hotel to discuss cybersecurity with the executives of top Silicon Valley firms. The mood was decidedly grim. A devastating cyber attack is likely to occur in the next 5 years, said a top HP exec. Companies are nowhere near prepared for it. Neither are the feds. There are plenty of comparisons to hurricanes and earthquakes. A slow-moving train wreck, one executive said. There is a kind of collective cognitive dissonance in Americans thinking about tech. We'll eagerly pursue new innovations like the Internet of Things and electronic health records, even as we're increasingly aware of how vulnerable such technology makes us to terrorists and to criminals. What struck me about the dinner, attended by executives from Hewlett-Packard, Cloudera, PayPal, and several others, along with academics and investors, was the naked pessimism expressed by those in the room. No one even tried to put a happy face on the situation. End of Thomas Lee. But I ask you, are those executives, investors, and academics getting the right answer for the wrong reasons? Are Jardine and or Pinker getting the wrong answer for the right reasons? Is it a truism that when risk cannot be estimated, it will be underestimated? How do we tell if we're getting better or getting worse? And how can we explain this to citizens, to regulators, and to reinsurers? Is Taleb right that fat-tailed distributions and asymmetry are where the risk lies, and which is more, that the apparent suppression of small failures is balanced by yet-to-be-observed black swan excursions? Saying it again, if the distributions of events that we care about in cybersecurity are describable not as Gaussian, but as power laws, then the best one could say is that most days will be better and better, and some will be worse than ever. Everything with a power law underneath has that property, and I submit that cyberspace's interconnectivity and interdependence are inherently power law phenomena. A fat-tail setting inherently resists prediction, but for that very reason, prediction is ever more compelling to pursue. So we get published predictions, lots of them. Many of them hedge their bets by phrasing their predictions as a question, but that only invokes what I know to call Betteridge's law of headlines, which is that any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered by the word no. It's a quandary. Fast change means tool sets for protection always trail the need unless the need can be forecast. Fast change makes forecasts hard if that fast change is one of adding mechanisms, not just scale, to the equation. We've got both scale, such as an Internet of Things with a 35% annual growth rate, and mechanism, such as afterthought interconnection of sundry gizmos, each with new interfaces. But to be deadly serious about cybersecurity, it requires that either we damp down the rate of change, slowing it enough to give prediction operational validity, or we purposefully increase unpredictability so that the opposition's targeting exercise grows too hard for them to do. If the former, we give up various forms of progress, and the latter, we give up various sorts of freedoms, as it would then be the machines in charge, not us. But look at that. I can't even talk about prediction without making a prediction. Why does this matter? There is no argument whatsoever that the proliferation of devices and information is empowering. It is categorically true, not to mention obvious, that technology today is far more democratically available than it was yesterday and less than it will be tomorrow. 3D printing, the whole maker community, do-it-yourself biology, micro-drones, search, home automation, constant contact with ever whom you choose to remain in constant contact with, instrumentation of every stripe and caliber, the steady migration of military technology to general government use, thence to the rich, thence to the lumpen proletariat. These are all examples of democratizing technology. This is perhaps our last fundamental trade-off before the singularity occurs. Do we as a society want the comfort and convenience of increasingly technologic, invisible digital integration enough to pay for those benefits with the liberties that must be given up to be protected from the downsides of that integration? If risk is that more things can happen than will, then what is the ratio of things that can now happen that are good to the number of things that can now happen that are bad? Is the good fraction growing faster than the bad fraction, or the other way around? Is there a threshold of interdependence beyond which good or bad overwhelmingly dominate? Now that we need cybersecurity protections to the degree that we do, to whom does the responsibility devolve? If the very worst laws are those that are unenforceable, what would we hope our lawmakers say about technologies that are not yet critical but might soon be? Do we forbid becoming critically dependent on them when it is the sheer magnitude of their adoption that makes them critically essential? How do we think about intelligence in this setting? Growth in personal power has meant that heretofore military needs like traffic analysis have become common needs. One then asks whether, when entities under attack, be they enterprises, carriers, or individuals, garner enough provenance to engage in strike back, should they? As a righteous societal good, we by law require that persons with disabilities not be prevented from the fullest possible participation in our society? Can we find the wisdom to do something equivalent for those who cannot or to the point will not accept the plethora of technologies that are redefining what full participation in society means? Can we preserve those options simultaneously? And if so, is that the surest way to prevent common mode failure? The need for what we have heretofore called cybersecurity is now so varied that it is no longer a single field, but many. There are over 800, perhaps over 1,000 cybersecurity startups in some stage of the funding game, a fair fraction of them spin-outs from highly focused university research projects. Generalists such as myself cannot be replaced. There's too much for the novitiate to learn. The core knowledge base has reached the point where new recruits can no longer hope to someday become competent generalists. Serial specialization is the only broad option open to them. As I say often, cybersecurity is perhaps the most difficult intellectual profession on the planet. Ray Kurzweil is beyond all doubt correct that within the career lifetime of nearly everyone in this room, algorithms will be smarter than we are, and they will therefore be called upon to do what we cannot, and that is to protect us from other algorithms, and to ask no permission in so doing. Do we, like Ulysses, lash ourselves to the mast, or do we, as some would say, relax and enjoy the inevitable? What would we have science do? What are the possible futures we will tolerate? What horses do we not want let out of the barn? Where do we put our intelligence budget? I've asked more questions and given answers. It's the best I can do. There's never enough time. Thank you for yours.